This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thanks everyone for coming, especially Professor Martyn Lyons, who's based in New South Wales, Australia, but has spent the last month in the UK, and we wanted to make the most of his presence in this country because he carried out the first oral history of reading with Lucy Tasker, Australian readers remember. And this was published back in 1992, so there's been quite a gap between then and now, and he's going to revisit this project. Since then, he's been publishing other works in the history of books. In fact, he's published 16 books, which seems an enormous number to read, let alone write, including A History of Reading and Writing in the Western World, published in 2010, and The Writing Culture of Ordinary People in Europe, 1860 to 1920, and that was published in 2013. He's also on the board of directors of the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing, otherwise known as SHARP, a shorter word, which is a great resource, I think, for people interested in publishing and reading. Okay, so I'll pass it over to Martyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming. As Shelley said, I'm talking about a project which was done quite a while ago now, and I'm not just going to present the project, the outlines of it, but I'm also going to look back on it a little bit with a critical, self-critical eye. I didn't bring a copy, but Shelley's got one here, and there it is. There's the cover anyway. This book was an experiment, that's how I look at it. I wanted to discover what oral testimonies could offer to the history of reading and reception. The interviews we conducted represented, I think, the first attempt to connect the approaches of book and reading historians with oral evidence from readers. And I think that within certain limits, the experiment was worthwhile. It drew attention to a valuable resource for historians of reading practices. And its importance, I also think, went beyond its local Australian setting. For example, when the Sapphire project of our Scottish colleagues called itself Scottish Readers Remember, I felt we had achieved some of the desired resonance, even if that project had its own individual methods and objectives. Historians of reading practices have often assumed that the only good reader is a dead one. Only after death, when your books and possessions have been inventoried or sold at auction, did the reader offer historians the kind of documentary sources at which their computers could digest. Sources like the post-mortem inventories, however, can never tell us how many books have been removed from private libraries even before the inventory was drawn up, sometimes because they were particularly treasured by the deceased family, or because, for the opposite reason, because they were in very bad condition and the auctioneer regarded them as being of no market value. Even when we can establish the presence of books in a household, we can't know how many were bought or inherited, we usually can't, how many had actually been read and by whom, or how many had stood unread on the shelf. In researching reading in the recent past, it's worth asking living readers and their families such questions. Of course, we can't expect them to give us a complete account of their past possessions, but unlike dead readers, they can at least respond to a few questions. The oral history of reading can throw light on sections of the reading public which traditional approaches have neglected. Oral history introduces readers from the margins of historiography, that's a cliche of the trade now, and it allows ordinary people a voice. Voices, of course, which are never spontaneous or unmediated, but are offered in response to an interviewer's question. Nevertheless, they are the voices of real readers from social groups who don't always speak for themselves. We can't construct a history of reading, I think, solely on the basis of what was published, in how many editions and in how many copies. we need to look for evidence on how readers responded to their texts. As Jonathan Rose urged in a provocative article over 20 years ago, we must interrogate the audience to build a reading-centred history of literature. Oral historians can literally interrogate the audience to reveal the reading practices of flesh and blood readers. So, our Australian study investigated the reading experience of a very heterogeneous cohort of 61 readers in the Sydney region. Our informants had little in common except their relatively advanced age, but this allowed us to make some tentative social and cultural comparisons, contrasting middle-class reading habits with those of workers, city dwellers with country dwellers, men with women. Of course, as a research method, oral history has a few specific characteristics. We study areas of the past which conventional historiography has obscured or marginalised. We've often been urged to check our data against written sources, judged to enjoy superior credibility. But in spheres like the history of reading, the oral historian is working with data which can never be corroborated in documentary sources for the simple reason that in this area they just don't exist. Oral testimony can help us construct a history of memory and a history of representations. Consider one model for me here is Luisa Passerini's research into the Turin working class under fascism, in which she tried to explain how her informants constructed their social identity as a group. So this study, like that one, is in part about readers' representations of themselves. Like all historians of reading, oral historians would like to know not just what books were produced and in what quantities, but who bought them. That's elusive information in itself. But also through many hands a given text might have passed, and what was the status of books in the households which found some use for them. A social history of the reading public has to consider the act of reading as a cultural practice and ask a series of questions about the history of the assimilation of literary culture. How were books received by their readers? In what circumstances did they read? Alone or in a group, silently or aloud, at home, at work, while sick, in the bath, on the train, whatever. Within what patterns of sociability did the act of reading occur in a given historical context? Were books read casually in the nonchalant way described by Richard Hoggart in The Uses of Literacy? Or were they read obsessively to satisfy an insistent and passionate curiosity, a desire for knowledge and emancipation? Were books revered, despised, or treated indifferently? And how did attitudes towards them differ amongst various social classes, religious denominations, men and women? Oral history can help us find a few answers to all those questions. Get the water. So my perspective here is not perhaps that of a traditional book historian, as I would call it, but rather of a historian of reading practices. I especially value the autobiographical testimonies of individual readers, both written and oral. I think they provide new, opportunities for the study of readers' experiences and attitudes to literature. So I always see reading as an active process. The reader is not just a receptacle and never comes to a text empty-handed without previously formed preferences and expectations. The reader brings to the text a literary culture which has developed over a lifetime and mental habits rooted in his or her background and social class. So in other words, readers' responses are connected to the cultural baggage they are carrying, and that in turn depends on their level of formal education, their father's profession, and many other factors. Readers take what they choose from their texts, reworking them and interpreting them in the context of tastes or concepts already inherited or acquired. Oral history illuminates several aspects of the reading public obscured by more traditional studies. The importance of reading aloud, for example, is made very clear in oral testimony, and the love of reciting aloud was shared by many members in this project of what I have called the poetry generation of 1914. This was perhaps the last generation for whom poetry had such an influence on the collective discourse that shaped their experience. This was an audience which not only read poetry but also recited it and wrote it. The London Times received about 100 poems per day on patriotic themes in August 1914. 50,000 war poems were written daily in Germany at the same time. And in Australia too, the veneration of canonical English literature often took a verbal form. Ena P.'s mother quoted great slabs of Shakespeare, unquote. Mother said Kathleen T., born 1902, and another survivor of the poetry generation, Mother used to quote Tennyson by the mile. Shakespeare's very popular around here, around this time. In our study, readers emerge with a fine sense of book consciousness and an appreciation of the book as a physical object. They appreciated the quality of book bindings, to quote Kathleen T. again. We collected small editions on very fine Indian paper of Dickens. Little Dorrit had a beautiful leather cover. Later on, I bought the whole edition, lovely green books with gold lettering on it. I've kept a mass of books. They were all beautiful big books with lovely bindings and good thick covers. You know, not like a lot of the ones these days that are so flimsy, and that, of course, they didn't cost the earth like the good ones cost these days. This is a very attractive cover. Actually, I can't give you the deep colour of it, but this is one of Macmillan's colonial editions. And another one that some interviewees mentioned was the picturesque atlas. Even the humblest readers had a code of practice to enforce respect for the book. Books, they said, should not be torn or scribbled on. One should never put a book down with the covers open. And in Australia, above all, library books should never be left out in the sun. A visit to any Sydney beach on a summer Sunday afternoon would no doubt cause some of our informants a great deal of anxiety on this score. So without oral evidence collected from actual readers, our study of book history stops short at the point of sale, it seems to me. The statistics of production and distribution are silent on questions about the usage of books by purchasers and borrowers. Oral testimony reveals hidden networks of readers, whether based on a neighbourhood, a religious community, a trade union, or a workplace. It shows us the everyday reading practices through which living readers appropriate their text. And it lays bare the myths and attitudes which determine how ordinary people represent their own reading. Before I go on, just let me explain the cover illustration, which reproduces the risque first page of the first issue of a paper called Beckett's Budget, which appeared in 1927. This magazine very quickly acquired an unsavoury reputation because of its sensational reports of divorces, adultery, sex crimes, and the like. Harassed by the churches and the government, Beckett's Budget didn't last very long and it was apparently forgotten, but not quite, however, because oral testimony showed that the notorious reputation of this ephemeral publication, it only lasted a few months, its reputation lived on in popular memory, and so, which conferred an unusual importance on it. So this was another little discovery for oral history. All right, let me outline a little bit how the project was conducted, how we located informants, what we asked them, and what criteria of analysis we adopted. We approached the interviews with a program of questions which are always flexible and which rarely expected a yes or no answer. This was not a questionnaire, but principally an attempt to elicit open-ended statements of opinion and attitude. A first group of questions established some essential demographic data: the respondent's age, principal places of residence during childhood and youth, religious affiliation, and a brief educational history. We took the father's profession as the yardstick of social status. A second set of questions dealt with the consumption of newspapers and magazines. All interviewees were asked which newspapers, if any, were regularly taken, how they were acquired, how they were received. In other words, who read the newspaper first? Did all the family read the newspaper, or just certain members? Were there special features which were particularly popular? And so we were actually questioning members of a society here with a very high rate of newspaper and magazine consumption, which is not surprising, really, given that Australia is prosperous and highly urbanised society with dense consumer markets where newspapers flourish, in Melbourne and Sydney, for example, in particular. There you go. We invited respondents to recall what books were present in the houses where they lived and where they were located. This is sometimes a revealing indicator of their status. You know, on the sideboard in the parlour, in the corner of the kitchen, etc. The subject's access to literature was the theme of a group of questions about the use of bookshops, lending libraries, mechanics institutes, itinerant booksellers, borrowed literature, and school prize books. We asked them about the fiction they were familiar with in their youth, as well as about the presence in the home of poetry and non-fiction, dictionaries, cookery books, Bibles, and professional handbooks. And to jog their memories a little, lists of well-known titles and authors were sometimes offered for comment. Although that was I must say that's a slightly dangerous operation in my experience. If you ask someone if they've read a certain book, they tend to think they should have, and they don't. They may not, and they may say they have, just to make sure you still think highly of them. The reading habits of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters were investigated to gather information on the ways gender difference affected reading practices. And at the same time, we looked for evidence of sexually stereotyped attitudes towards readers, for example, on the recurrent image of the female as a superficial reader of light or romantic fiction, and the equivalent male image of the sporting, outdoor, adventurous, and therefore anti-intellectual type. Readers were invited to recall various traditional reading practices, as I call them, such as reading aloud, especially of the Bible. We asked them to describe their own reading today in order to invite a statement of their own perspective, looking back on a lifetime's reading. And those questions aim to discover what was most frequently read, how did readers obtain access to their own and parents' reading matter, and how was that literature used, and what was the status of books in the household. Finally, we asked interviewees about other leisure pursuits and sources of entertainment, the cinema, theatre and music, in order to situate reading more accurately in the general context of leisure activities. So our interviews explored the cultural life of two generations of Australians, those of the informants themselves when young and those of their parents as far as they could be remembered. These generations lived at a unique cultural conjuncture. They had already achieved a mastery of literate culture at the end of the 19th century and were only beginning to become familiar with radio and the cinema in the 1920s and 30s. There you are, early radio. It's a group activity, early radio. These were the generations which belonged to what I call the golden age of the book, before the electronic media displaced the supremacy of print. So we conducted 80 interviews of 61 informants, often prolonging the first interview with a second, and I really feel quite strongly that a second interview is almost essential to fill in gaps, iron out ambiguities, collect memories which only surfaced after the first meeting. We used what in the jargon would be, although I don't use this jargon, would be called a combination of purposive and availability sampling. In other words, we sometimes interviewed whoever answered a general invitation, and at other times we aimed to recruit specific types of interviewees. Retirement villages or old people's homes were a helpful source of contact, as were trade unions, retired members' associations, local historical societies, and the local press. But retirement villages and historical societies put us in touch with mainly middle-class readers, a tendency we tried to compensate for by looking for working-class readers through the trade unions. There were just two essential qualifications. Interviewees had to have been born in Australia or to have spent most of their lives there, and they had to be over 70. So in practice, we collected testimony relating to a period which went sometimes as far back as the 1890s. The interviews had a pretty good memory of the 1920s and 30s. That was where most of the information is concentrated. But we sent the end point of our study in 1933, which was when the Australian edition of Women's Weekly first appeared. That's a kind of, and that had a marked impact on reading habits. It seemed like a suitable enough point to choose as the end point of the study. We tested the demographic profile of this little cohort against the New South Wales population censuses of 1901, 1911 and 1921. Our group reflected the community as a whole in terms of religious affiliation. That's to say, there was a majority of Anglicans and there was near parity between the number of Catholics and nonconformist Protestants. Places of birth also roughly matched the census. In 1901, 3/4 of the population of New South Wales was born in Australia. We had a slight majority of women over men. That was not typical of the period. The general profile of the interviewee group departed from that of the population as a whole in two important aspects. Firstly, inhabitants of Sydney were overrepresented and country dwellers were correspondingly underrepresented. It was pretty hard to compensate for that disequilibrium without more time and money for travel. We classified urban residents into three groups: the Sydney inner city dwellers, residents of the outer suburbs, and interstate urban residents from states other than New South Wales. Rural residents were classed as either inhabitants of country towns or of remote districts. We found our cohort gave too much weight to readers in the higher social groups. One of the dangers, I think, of trying to recruit people for a oral history reading project is that you tend to attract people who are readers, who do a lot of reading, and that doesn't give you a terribly representative sort of group if you're aiming for that. So families of businessmen and the liberal professions were overrepresented. In the end, although we tried to do something about this, in fact only about 30% of informants roughly belonged to the working classes, skilled or unskilled. So oral testimony has its own specific structures. It obeys its own laws. Oral biographies don't follow the narrative patterns of the written autobiographies, particularly those of the 19th or early 20th century. In the classic form, those written autobiographies tend to begin at the beginning, they proceed through the middle, and they arrive at the end. But oral autobiographies can begin anywhere and proceed by means of flashbacks, sudden leaps ahead, repetitions, and unpredictable digressions. Memories can be telescoped, and the historian must sometimes re-establish the informant's sense of historical time. Private memories also have their own calendar. In this study, life was often divided into the period before and after marriage, and that calendar only occasionally coincides with great public events, such as, in the case of this study, the First World War. Memory, of course, is selective, but not gratuitously so. The memory tends to delete what doesn't reinforce the self-image one wants to present to the interviewer and to oneself. And so if an individual can't recall what books were present in the house or their parents' house, it might not be accidental. Books can be forgotten because they were not considered important, and that's evidence in its own right. And amnesia can be evidence in its own right. The judgments of respondents on their past are also refracted through double time filters of the past and the present. So readers who told us that nowadays people read only rubbish and who dismissed a lot of TV programs in the same sort of way, judged these things with a set of moral values they had acquired perhaps 50 years beforehand. And their judgments also filtered through the norms of the present. So people who told us about the lack of Australian history taught in their school days did so in the light of a recent upsurge in Australian self-consciousness. They wouldn't have thought that way at the time. George H., born in 1915, reflected, I realised what a biased teaching of history was ours. We only knew English history. And as far as I can make out, when in England they were just getting down out of the trees, Europe was a very advanced lot of people. Which astounds me, because we only knew English history. Europe was absolutely non-existent, and Australia was too. George lamented the scant treatment of Australian history on the curriculum. Interviewees condemned this neglect today. 50 years previously, they'd taken it for granted. And when George H. also went on to condemn the early settlers for desecrating the countryside, as he called it, he was commenting on the past in the light of very contemporary ecological concerns. Another problem initially affected relations between ourselves and the interviewees. A few of them felt uncomfortable when questioned about their level of education and their reading by university-trained historians, particularly if they left school at the usual age of 14. The stigma of illiteracy remained powerful, and we rapidly realised that too direct a question about parents' ability to read and write could provoke a hostile reaction. Of course, illiteracy was a marginal problem, and only 4 informants remembered a parent who was partially or completely illiterate. In 2 cases, they came not from non-English speaking backgrounds. Very few were able to address this issue as openly and as boldly as one interviewee, Joan P. The memory of her stepfather, who was a labourer who could sign his name but not read, was not a problem for her. She just laughed him off as a hillbilly. A few interviewees felt the need to impress the interviewer by their general culture and their scholastic achievements. This is partly the defensive reaction of men and women whose secondary education had been incomplete when faced with university academics with tape recorders. At the same time, we encountered a form of, I don't know what to call it, it's that cultural boasting by people from usually quite wealthy backgrounds who had benefited from a private education. Like the people living in this photo, wealthy Sydney family photographed here. They've got books in all over this drawing room in every corner if you look closely at the back and the side. This was the case with Nora Kay, born 1911, who grandly declared that there were well over 2,000 books in the house where she had grown up. This cultural elitism was also apparent when she was asked to characterise the clientele of Angus and Robertson's bookshop, very important bookshop in Sydney, which her family and acquaintances used in the 1920s. She replied thoughtfully about, what sort of people went there. I'd say mainly intellectuals, rather than working class, let's put it that way. And a few interviewees saw the interviewer as someone clearly interested in books and assumed that there was a kind of cultural rapport. For Letty O, born 1913, we were both defenders of a besieged culture. When she just said this on the doorstep as I was leaving, and therefore it's not on tape. She said, there's no official recognition of culture today in Australia. People like you and me must ensure that books are still valued. That was a kind of attempt to enlist me as an accomplice in a kind of very dubious cultural crusade, which I resisted and I found very uncomfortable about it. Others were proud of their cultural level for other reasons. A few autodidacts, all men, had a specific literary culture of their own, based essentially on the reading they considered serious and useful and not recreational. They often refused to read fiction. Randolph H., born 1915, the son of a Methodist minister, told us, "My greatest pride and joy is the Australian Dictionary of Biography." "I'm not really interested in novels at all, except Australian," and he repeated, "I've never been interested in light reading other than Australian literature." So only his nationalism mitigated his distaste for recreational reading. Randolph H. maintained the self-taught reader's thirst for knowledge. He had already obtained 2 diplomas at the University of the Third Age, and he was following university courses at the time he was being interviewed. In spite of this, the opposite was more common, that's to say, the denigration of one's own reading culture. Many women in particular began their interview by insisting that there was never any time for reading, because there were always so many things to be done around the house or the farm, children to be raised, and in the absence of today's battery of domestic appliances which allegedly make the job easier. But such protests should never be accepted at face value. Further questioning frequently revealed that a considerable amount of reading was done, albeit of a fragmentary nature, whether of newspapers, magazines, or books themselves. Evenings and Sundays provided respite from household tasks when housewives could relax, but clearly they could not represent themselves as relaxing without feeling guilty. Why did interviewees so vigorously deny the existence of their reading activity and run down their own cultural competence? Several women insisted that they only read things of no interest, or stupid tripe. "I think working class people had a bad attitude to reading in those days," said Kate A., born 1918, and herself the wife of a docker. "My mother regarded reading as a waste of time. If she caught us reading, then we were wasting our time." So reading was condemned as an idle pursuit, which offended against a rather demanding work ethic. Mabel T., born 1912, described herself as follows: a keen reader, but I'm not really a good reader. I don't draw up lists of books to read to educate myself or anything like that, so I just read higgle-piggle. Mother was busy with 7 children. I don't think she read as much as she'd have liked to have read. No, she didn't read much, and then in older life she was just reading nonsense things. Nothing very awful, just fiction stories, simple stories. Well, romance really, not the worst romance. So, like many others, she gave no legitimacy to her own or her mother's reading, accepting a conventional view that their reading was inferior in comparison to the reading of edifying literary classics which they'd been taught to regard as worthwhile. They condemned their own culture rather than challenged the values of official literary culture, which held up paragons like Dickens, Shakespeare, and other canonical monuments of English literature. Only exceptionally did we encounter someone who explicitly rejected the values of dominant literary culture. Henry Kay, a communist born in 1907 and a docker, respected what he read as part of a vernacular culture which ran counter to orthodox ideas. He denounced the racist prejudices of the press of his day, like Smith's Weekly, for instance, something very few interviews were prepared to do. His reading took on a Marxist and atheist direction after he discovered Das Kapital while working on a Queensland sugar plantation. Workers he'd met on the road looking for jobs had spoken to him about socialist literature, which he had found in a library in Queensland in Marianne. His reflections show how a cultural institution sponsored by capitalism, a library and a sugar mill, could be used for oppositional objectives. So, very briefly, 1 or 2 themes. How am I doing? Okay. Firstly, the persistence of what I've called traditional modes of literacy, and this concept derives largely from the work of David Hall on New England and Rolf Engelsing on Northern Germany. For these historians, the scarcity of books, the practice of the scarcity of books, the practice of reading and rereading a handful of familiar texts, and an unusual respect for print culture were features of a traditional or intensive reading style. Reading aloud in family groups, usually in a religious context, was another aspect of this traditional literacy. Texts were often memorized and recited by heart. A number of our interviewees had a close acquaintance with this mode of reading. They would have recognized some affinities between those studies I just mentioned, which involve 18th century Connecticut, 19th century Bremen, and in this case early 20th century Sydney. One important link between them all was the strength of evangelical Protestantism. The presence of the family Bible, the practice of communal reading in a religious context, and the respect which books inspired as physical objects all evoke a world of reading we've lost. 20 interviewees recalled a family Bible, that's about 1 in 3. It was a weighty and substantial possession. Large, thick, or great was how informants remembered it. They remembered that births, marriages and deaths, and sometimes baptisms and confirmations too, were recorded in its pages. The family Bible registered and commemorated every landmark and rite of passage in the Christian life of succeeding generations. It was a confident statement of family unity and continuity. Interviewees suggested it was generally handed down through the female line. It was essentially, but not exclusively, a Protestant tradition. A quarter of interviewees remembered collective reading of religious texts in their childhood, daily family readings of the Bible, or Sunday readings involving the Bible or prayer books. For Laura P., born 1911, collective Bible reading was a central family institution. Reading the Bible, she said, was a part of our life. Her father, who was a classics graduate and a teacher at an elite Sydney public school, government school, led family prayers, and if there were any guests for dinner, they were included in the reading. After dinner, the family would read round the Bible, which meant that each member would take a verse in turn around the table. Traditional literacy practices were strongest in inner city Sydney and country towns. They seem to have died out fastest in the outer suburbs. The key here perhaps lies in the survival of a communal social and cultural life. A collective life, a sense of community, were best maintained in country towns and to a lesser extent the inner city. In suburbia and the bush, the individual was, for different reasons, more isolated. Books were objects of lasting value which needed to be protected, respected, and on occasion displayed to advantage. Working class interviewees had little money to spend on the exhibition of family treasures, and book storage was therefore quite unceremonious. Amelia F. remembered books kept in a chiffonnier, and several families stacked books on the sideboard in the dining room. Even this was a public location and could indicate a deliberate desire to display the books. Henry Kay told us, he's the communist one, that the books on the sideboard were only for looks, if they had a shiny back or a hard cover. Bookcases were more common in middle and upper class families, but you could find them at all social levels. Ronald L., who came from a working class but upwardly mobile family, remembered that his mother built a bookcase into the corner of one room and fitted it with lead light doors so that Ronald felt appropriate to call it the library. But it was the cedar bookcase which signified much more, and this can be legitimately regarded as an Australian status symbol of the period. Several interviews mentioned the cedar bookcase, and its beauty and craftsmanship made it a fitting piece of furniture for the proud display of valued books. And this was especially recalled by lower middle class and professional families. The most valued family books, which is not necessarily the ones that were most read, were displayed in the front room or the parlour. This was the main reception room. Their presence in the formal and public space of the house was a sign of their revered status. As I said, you can see them in this Banksia drawing room. Charlotte C. remembered books in the smoking room, site of the upper class ritual of taking coffee after dinner. This is in an 8-bedroom house in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Other social groups also showed a desire to assert their status and reveal their respect for formal culture. Emily M., whose father had received very little formal education, built what amounted to a family shrine. He made a special table, inlaid and finely polished, on which lay the family Bible and other treasures. In the parlours and bookcases of New South Wales, books were preserved with loving care and traditional respect for their value as material objects. So, that's just a few snippets really. Looking back on the project as a whole, how would I now define its achievements and its shortcomings? Well, I think this book demonstrated one very literal way of responding to Jonathan Rose's challenge to interrogate the audience and investigate the responses and the practices of readers themselves. For a closer glimpse of readers' responses, the historian needs personal accounts, diaries, autobiographies, oral testimonies in which individual readers describe their reading experiences and allow us to appreciate their enormous diversity. The exponents of German reception theory give us a putative reader, the hidden reader, the implied reader, whose presence is deduced from literary text, usually canonical texts. But those theories fail to satisfy, I believe, the cultural historian's thirst for contact with actual readers, and that's what I'm really on about, and most of my work is concerned with actual readers. We need personal sources to lead us to these flesh and bone readers who write or speak about their books, preferences, loves and hates, and inform us consciously or unconsciously about the status and function of reading in different phases of their lives. Australian readers, remember, did this, and that's why I think we still need an oral history of reading. Another thing we did right was to try to capture the flavour of colloquial Australian speech in the period. Of course, in transcribing testimony, we added punctuation, we omitted most of the ums and ers and wells, which normally preface any statement. But we kept faith with the vocabulary and the grammar, or the lack of it, of our respondents. And when our publisher at University Press complained that parts of the text were not in standard English and should be corrected, we fought them on this and we won. And this was how the respondents spoke, and they couldn't be misrepresented. And I felt fully vindicated on this point when the book was selected by the Australian National Dictionary Centre for inclusion in the National Corpus, which is a kind of lexicographical database of Australian usage. So there's kind of there's bits of slang here from the period which that database wanted to capture. And I felt even more vindicated when it became, this is actually an audio book as well, produced by what was then known as the Royal Victorian Society for the Blind. It's not called that anymore because the royal bit became politically incorrect, and so it was dropped. And also it didn't want to stick to Victoria, it wanted to be national. It's now called Vision Australia. Of course, there are a few things which in hindsight I regret. Firstly, and most obviously, the project was seriously underfunded. I received a grant of about $16,000 from the Australian Research Council, which a paltry sum in my opinion, at the time roughly equivalent to a university lecturer's salary for 1 year. I was a naive, I'm not just blaming the parsimony of the government, I'm blaming myself, because I was a naive novice in the field. I didn't realise how much it costs to do oral history. I should have asked for much more to start with. More funding would have permitted us to produce full verbatim transcripts instead of the partial transcripts which we worked with. And we might have balanced our cohort of interviewees a little better in terms of geographical spread and social status. We might even have managed to include some indigenous readers who are completely absent here. So as well as being underfunded, the project was, in my view, under-theorised. Pierre Bourdieu might have helped me discuss the sociology of taste as demonstrated by our interviewees from different social backgrounds each with a different habitus, as Bourdieu would say, endowed with different cultural and economic capital. But he remains absent from the text. I might have read our data differently through the prism of new literacy studies, emphasizing the antithesis between vernacular and dominant literacy practices. Through this lens, I might have had a clearer view of the exact situation of reading and writing in specific social contexts, and of the differences between home literacy, school literacy, and workplace literacy. But of course, David Barton and Mary Hamilton hadn't published local literacies when I was writing this book, but still, the point about under-theorization still stands. I was very interested in reading practices, which I think is the strength of the book, but I neglected to investigate more deeply the ways in which individual readers interpreted their texts. Further probing, perhaps, and a bit more sensitivity to this question may have produced interesting evidence of readers reimagining and appropriating texts for their own purposes. What did those women really think of the Romance literature they consumed? What was it in Charles Dickens that readers were stimulated by? I don't think those questions were pursued far enough. When I finished this book, I thought that the future agenda would be a series of micro-studies on the reading practices of distinct reading communities. Australian readers, remember, involved a very heterogeneous group of interviewees. It might be worthwhile, I assume, to take a more coherent group of people in a factory, a club, or even in the same apartment building, and study their reading. And I'm disappointed by the lack of such studies, which is no criticism of Nathalie Ponsard's study of workers in the suburbs of Rouen between the wars, or Janice Radway's study of Romance readers in the American Midwest. I think there's plenty of room for more such studies, and if I was to start one today, which I'm not going to, but if I was to start one, I would go further in that direction, and I would investigate the role of writing as well now, alongside the role of reading, to achieve a more holistic view of literacy practices. Thank you for your patience.